They told her the cabin was all she would get. A rotting heap of timber at the end of a broken road. A cruel joke handed to a grieving daughter by the people who had just stripped away everything else. Her home, her future, the promise her father made 100 times. Gone. In less than an hour. At a long polished table by smiling faces that did not reach their eyes. So she drove into the mountains with nothing, and she screamed into the dark on her first lonely night. But here is what they never understood about that ruin. Her father chose it. He chose it carefully, quietly, for a reason no one alive could guess, because beneath those rotting floorboards, behind a wall of cold stone, something was waiting. Something that would bring an entire empire crashing down. She just had to find it first. They say blood is thicker than water, but when millions are placed on a table, blood becomes nothing more than dried ink on paper. A signature, a clause, a single line written by someone else, deciding the shape of your whole life. This is a story about a young woman who learned that lesson in the cruelest way a person can. A story about a daughter who lost everything in one quiet afternoon and found something far stranger waiting for her deep in the dark beneath the floor of a house nobody wanted. So settle in and listen close. The room smelled of leather and old money. Polished wood, cold glass, a long table that stretched out like a runway, between people who used to call one another family. Eleanor Brandt sat at the far end of it, 24 years old. Her hands were folded tight in her lap so that no one would see them shake. She wore a plain gray dress. The only black thing she owned had already been packed away in a box. She hadn't known that morning that grief would come asking for it again so soon. Across from her sat Diane, her stepmother, wrapped in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Eleanor's tired old car. Her face was arranged into the careful shape of mourning, the kind that lives only on the surface. The eyes above it were dry, calm, already counting. Beside Diane sat Wesley, the stepbrother, leaning back in his chair like a man who already knew exactly how this story was going to end. And he did. The lawyer cleared his throat. He was an older man with tired eyes, and he would not look at Eleanor. Not once. He shuffled the papers in front of him the way a person shuffles a hand of cards they would rather not have to play. To my wife, Diane, he read, I leave the family home. The words landed soft, then heavier. The property by the lake, the savings, and the controlling share of the company. Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. The company. Her father had built that company out of nothing. Out of a single truck and a worn notebook full of impossible ideas. She had grown up inside it. She knew its bones. She knew the math that made it run. Had learned it sitting cross-legged on the floor of his study while he sketched his diagrams on the backs of old envelopes and explained the world to her in numbers. He had told her, more times than she could count, that one day, all of it would be hers. To my son, Wesley, the lawyer went on, I leave the remaining share of the company and the collection of automobiles. Wesley smiled, just a little, just enough. The room went quiet. Eleanor waited. She told herself there had to be more. A trust. The shares she'd been promised, year after year. Some piece of the life she had given 2 years of her own to protect. while she sat at her father's bedside through the long, slow months of his illness, holding his hand, reading to him in the dark when the pain kept him awake. The lawyer turned a page. His voice dropped lower. "And to my daughter, Eleanor." He paused. "I leave the cabin, the old one, on the ridge." Silence. Eleanor blinked. "The cabin," she repeated. Her own voice sounded strange to her, thin, coming from somewhere far away. The hunting cabin?" The lawyer nodded, his eyes fixed on the table. "It's been empty for years," she said slowly. "It's falling apart. My father hated that place." She leaned forward. "What about my trust? The shares? He promised me. He promised me 100 times. I'm sorry." The lawyer finally lifted his eyes to meet hers, and what she saw there was somehow worse than cruelty. It was pity. "The trust was dissolved," he said quietly. "Some months ago, the funds were folded back into the main estate, the estate that now belonged to Diane." Eleanor stood. Her chair scraped hard against the floor, too loud in that silent, beautiful room. "That's not possible," she said. "My father would never do this. He despised that cabin. He only bought the land because it bordered the park." And there it was, the first crack, the first small sign that something underneath this whole terrible morning did not fit together the way it should. Because the man she knew, the man who taught her to question everything, to never ever trust a number that didn't add up, that man would not have left his only daughter a rotting heap of timber in the middle of nowhere. Not without a reason, but she didn't know that yet. In that moment, all she knew was the cold spreading slow through her chest, reaching for her heart. Diane rose from her chair, buttoned her jacket, smoothed it down with one ringed hand. "People change their minds, dear," she said. Her voice was sweet, poisonously sweet. "Your father saw, near the end, that Wesley had the real head for business. And you." She let her gaze drift over Eleanor, slow, cool, like she was appraising a piece of furniture she had already decided to throw away. "You were always the dreamer. The woods will suit you." "You did this," Eleanor whispered. She wasn't even angry yet. The anger would come later, in the long nights ahead. Right now, there was only disbelief, vast and cold and bottomless. "He was sick," she said. "He was on medication those last months. You were the one who gave it to him. You were the one who—" "Careful." Wesley's voice, sharp, cutting across the room. "That's a very ugly thing to say about a grieving widow." He smiled again, and again it didn't reach his eyes. "Besides, the papers are signed, witnessed. There's nothing here for you to fight." Eleanor looked at the two of them, and slowly she understood. In less than an hour, she had lost everything. Her father, her home, the future he had promised her. Over and over, in 1,000 quiet moments she would carry for the rest of her days. Gone. Diane was already walking toward the door. She paused at the threshold, didn't bother to turn around. "I'll need you out of the house by tomorrow," she said. "I'm having the rooms redone. Your things will only be underfoot." A breath. "And the job, of course. We're going in a different direction." The door closed behind her with a soft, expensive click, and Eleanor stood alone in that cold and gilded room, with nothing left to her name but a key to a ruin she had never wanted, in a place her father had sworn he hated. The next day passed in a fog of small, sharp humiliations. Diane stood by the front door of the only home Eleanor had ever known, arms crossed, watching. A hired man stood at her shoulder, just to be certain that nothing left the house which hadn't first been approved. As if Eleanor were a thief, in the very house where she had learned to walk. She packed slowly. Her clothes, a handful of photographs in their frames, her father's old notebooks, the leather worn soft at the corners, the pages filled with his sharp, slanting handwriting and his diagrams and all his impossible, beautiful dreams. She carried it out, box by box, and loaded it into the back of a tired old car that had long since seen its better years. And when at last she drove away down that long, curving driveway, the iron gate swung shut behind her with a sound like a coffin lid, sealing off the only life she had ever known. She had a little money, not much, enough for gas and a few weeks of careful, frugal meals, if she didn't let herself want for anything. She had no one to call, and nowhere on this earth to go. So she went to the only place that was left to her. She typed the cabin's location into her phone, watched the thin blue line appear across the map, threading off into the high country, into the green and the wild. And she pointed the car toward the mountains. It was a long drive, hours of flat gray highway, giving way at last to rolling green hills, and the hills giving way, mile by mile, to something older, something wilder. The towns grew smaller. The spaces between them grew longer and lonelier. She cried for the first part of it, cried until there was nothing left inside her to come out, and the road blurred into smears of light, and she had to pull onto the shoulder and press her forehead against the steering wheel and simply breathe. In, out, in, out. Then she wiped her face, and she drove on. Because there was nothing else to do. By the time the sun began to sink behind the ridgeline, the highway had narrowed to a county road, and the county road had dwindled to something barely worth the name. A dirt track, rutted and forgotten, winding up into trees so tall and so old that they closed over her like a roof and swallowed the last of the daylight whole. The old car groaned over the potholes. Bare branches reached out and scraped along the windows, like fingers, like the woods themselves were feeling for her in the dark. And then, the headlights found it. The cabin. She put the car in park, and for a long moment, she just looked. It was worse than anything she had let herself imagine. The roof sagged in the middle, like the spine of some old and weary animal that had finally lain down to rest. Shingles were missing in patches, the way teeth go missing from a tired old smile. The porch had half collapsed beneath the weight of a fallen branch. The windows were dark and filmed with grime, staring back at her out of the gathering dusk like the hollow eyes of something that had been dead a very long time. Ivy had climbed the walls and choked the timber. The forest was quietly taking the place back, slow and patient, the way the forest always does, when no one is left to stop it. This was it. This was what her father had left for her. A ruin. Eleanor leaned her head against the steering wheel, and there, in the deep and pressing silence of those woods, with no living soul for miles to hear her, she finally let herself scream. The first days at the cabin were a kind of war, a war against rot and cold, and the slow creeping despair that came for her every single night, the moment the dark came down over the ridge. There was no electricity, no running water. The nearest town was a long, jolting drive back down that broken road. A small place, barely more than a few weathered buildings clustered along a single street. The kind of town the rest of the world had simply forgotten. She spent what little money she dared on the things a person needs to stay alive. A small camp stove, a pair of lanterns, bleach and heavy bags, and a cheap set of tools. The kind that bend if you so much as look at them wrong. And then she worked. She had never in her life worked the way she worked now. She hauled the fallen branch off the porch with a rusted saw she found half buried in the old shed. She scrubbed years of grime and dust and the leavings of small animals out of the wooden floorboards, on her hands and knees until her fingers were raw. When a storm came rolling in over the ridge one night, shaking the whole cabin to its bones, she climbed up onto that broken roof in the pouring rain and lashed a tarp over the worst of the holes, soaked to the skin, shaking, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely hold the rope, hammering until her arms simply gave out beneath her. Her hands that had only ever known keyboards and blueprints and the smooth worn pages of her father's notebooks, blistered, split, bled. And yet, there was something in the work, something that held the grief at arm's length, something that gave her hands a task so that her mind could stop circling the same dark question over and over and over again, like a wolf pacing a fence. How could he do this to me? The body sometimes can carry what the heart cannot. So she let it. She let the work carry her, day by aching day, when nothing else could. But she was not entirely alone. She didn't notice it at first. She was too tired, too lost inside her own ruin to see anything beyond it. But the world, it seemed, had a quiet way of leaving small kindnesses where a person might stumble upon them. The first time she drove into town, half-starved and trying to make a few crumpled bills stretch into a week, she stopped at a little diner on the corner, a faded sign above the door, windows warm with yellow light, and the smell, drifting out into the cold street, of coffee and fresh bread. A woman ran the place, older, gray hair pinned back from a soft, lined face, the kind of face that has weathered its own share of hard winters, and somewhere along the way had simply decided to be kind anyway. Margaret, the others called her. Eleanor ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, a single bowl of soup. She counted her coins out on the counter, one by one, her cheeks burning. And when the bowl came, it was fuller than it had any right to be, with thick slices of bread on the side she hadn't paid for, and a wedge of pie, warm from the oven, that she certainly hadn't ordered. On the house, Margaret said, before Eleanor could even open her mouth to protest. New faces eat free the first time. House rule. It wasn't a real rule. They both knew that perfectly well. But Eleanor didn't have the strength left in her to argue, and something in her chest, something that had been frozen solid since that cold room with the long polished table, thawed, just a little, just for a moment. "Thank you," she managed. Her voice came out rough. Margaret only nodded and turned back to wiping down the counter, as if a stranger's kindness were the most ordinary thing in all the world, as if it cost her nothing at all to be gentle with a girl who clearly had nothing left. Then there was the old man. She never once saw him arrive. That was the strangest part of it. She came out onto the porch one gray morning to find a neat stack of dry firewood waiting beside the door, split clean, stacked careful, as though someone had stood there in the dark while she slept, doing quiet and patient work, and asking nothing at all in return. The next morning, another stack, and on the third day, at last, she caught sight of him, a figure at the very edge of the trees, where the deep forest gave way to her ragged clearing, an old man, weathered as the mountains themselves. He had a still, quiet way of standing, like he belonged to the land far more than the land could ever belong to anyone. He didn't come any closer. He only lifted one hand, a small, slow wave. And then he was gone, melting back into the green like he had never been there at all. Later, in town, Margaret told her his name was Silas, that he had lived up on that ridge longer than anyone could rightly remember, that he kept to himself, mostly, and troubled no one. "But he watches over the ones up there," Margaret said, pouring coffee into a chipped white cup. "Always has done. Couldn't tell you why he picks the ones he picks." She gave Eleanor a long, knowing sort of look over the rim of the pot. "Seems he's gone and picked you." Eleanor didn't quite know what to make of that. She only knew that the firewood kept appearing, and that the long, cold nights felt, somehow, a little less empty for it. There was a strange and bitter truth she was beginning to learn, up there in her ruin, that the people who shared her own blood had thrown her away without so much as a backward glance, and the people who owed her absolutely nothing, a woman with a soup ladle and a warm kitchen, an old man with an armful of split wood. Those were the ones who had reached out a hand to her in the dark. Family, she was slowly learning, is not always the thing you are born into. Sometimes it is the thing you find when you have lost everything else. On the 8th day, the main room of the cabin was at last something close to livable. It was one large open space with a high vaulted ceiling, and at its very heart stood the one thing in the whole crumbling building that had not surrendered to time: the fireplace. It was enormous, built of river stone, floor to ceiling, broad and solid and strangely grand for such a small and humble cabin. The mortar still held firm. The stones still stood true. It was, Eleanor thought, almost too large, out of all proportion with everything around it, as though it had been built for some other greater purpose entirely, and the little cabin had simply grown up around it, like bark around a buried stone. She didn't think much of it, not at first. The mountain nights had turned bitter and sharp, and she wanted a fire, a real one, the kind that fills a room with warm light and pushes the dark back into its corners and makes a ruin feel, for an hour or two, like a home. So she gathered her kindling, stacked it careful in the great cold hearth, and struck a match. The paper caught, the small flame climbed, and then the smoke turned wrong. Instead of rising, instead of drawing up the chimney the way smoke is meant to do, it rolled backward, out and into the room, a gray and bitter cloud billowing up into her face, stinging her eyes, catching in her throat. She staggered back, coughing, waving it away, frowning hard. A blocked chimney, she thought. That was all it could be. A bird's nest, packed in tight, of fallen stone. Years of dead leaves, choking the flue. She took her flashlight and she leaned in close to look. But the flue was clear, wide open, clean. The chimney rose straight up and unblocked, all the way to a small dark square of night sky high above, and that made no sense at all. Eleanor crouched there in the cold gray ashes, and she made herself think, the way her father had taught her to think. Slowly, carefully, one single piece at a time. If the chimney was clear, then why on earth hadn't the smoke gone up? She raised her lighter, held the small trembling flame close to the back wall of the firebox, where the stone stood solid and ancient and undisturbed, and the flame bent, not up, sideways. It flickered hard and flattened out, pulled toward the back wall, toward solid, unbroken stone. There was a draft coming through the rock, a steady, patient pull of air drawn through a place where there should have been nothing at all but mortar and stone and the cold, dark heart of the mountain pressing in behind it. Eleanor went very, very still. Stone does not breathe. She had grown up at the elbow of a man who built things, a man who understood, down in his bones, exactly how the world was put together. A man who could not abide a single thing that did not make sense. And every instinct he had ever pressed into her was suddenly wide awake and screaming, "Stone does not breathe." She crawled fully into the great hearth now, forgetting the cold, forgetting the ash smearing itself across her clothes and her cheeks. She ran the beam of her flashlight slowly over the back wall, inch by careful inch, and her heart began to pound against her ribs like something trying to get out. At first, it looked like any other wall, rough river stone, old gray crumbling mortar. But then her fingers found it, a difference. The mortar along the side walls was coarse, sandy, crumbling away at the edges with age, the way old mortar always does, given enough long and lonely years. But here, outlining a clean rectangular section of the back wall, perhaps 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide. Here, the mortar was smooth, unnaturally smooth, cool and slick beneath her fingertips, in a way that old crumbling mortar simply is not. It wasn't mortar at all. It was something else, something newer, something carefully made to look like the ancient stone around it, colored to match it, dusted over to disguise it, done with care and patience and the steady hand of a craftsman who knew exactly what he was doing. Done by someone who did not want it to ever be found, unless you were someone who knew to look. Eleanor knelt there in the dark of the cold hearth, her flashlight trembling in one ash-streaked hand, her breath fogging in the freezing air, and she whispered into the silence, "What did you build here?" The cabin gave her no answer. Outside, the wind moved low through the ancient trees, soft, slow, like something vast and patient, exhaling, and far below her, deep beneath the rotting floor of a house that the whole wide world had decided was worthless. Something waited there, in the dark, something her father had left behind, for her, and for no one else. That smooth patch of false stone changed everything, because once a person sees a thing that does not belong, they can never quite unsee it again. And Eleanor Brandt was the daughter of a man who had spent his entire life refusing to look away from the things that did not add up. So she did not sleep that night. She sat on the cold, hard floor of the cabin, a thin blanket pulled around her shoulders, the lantern guttering low and orange beside her. And she stared into the dark, open mouth of that great stone fireplace. And she thought as the lantern flickered and dimmed. She thought as the cold deepened and the wind moved low through the trees outside. She thought until the first gray light of dawn began to seep in through the grimy windows, pale and slow. And in those long black hours, she found her mind drifting backward, back to the man himself. She remembered being small, 6, maybe 7, sitting on the floor of his study while a winter storm threw itself against the windows, and her father, kneeling beside her on the rug, sliding a single coin across the floorboards toward her. "Watch," he'd said. "Don't blink." And he had set the coin spinning and told her that the world was full of hidden things, things that hide in plain sight, things that only show themselves to the patient, to the ones who keep watching long after everyone else has looked away. Most people, he'd told her, see a wall, and they think, wall. They never wonder what might be behind it. She had been too young then to understand him, but she understood him now. Oh, she understood him now. By the time the first gray light came, she had the beginning of a plan, a small one, a simple one. But a beginning is a beginning. She remembered the notebooks, her father's notebooks, the ones she had carried out of her old life in a battered cardboard box, almost without thinking, almost as an afterthought in those last frantic hours of packing, with Diane watching from the doorway and the hired man at her shoulder, as if some quiet, knowing part of her had understood, even then, that she might one day need them. She went out to the car in the raw cold of the morning, dug through the boxes with stiff, aching fingers, and carried them back inside, an armful of worn leather and soft yellowed paper, and set them down in a small circle of lantern light on the floor. Then she began to read, page after page, diagram after diagram. His handwriting filled every one of them, sharp, slanting, restless, the way his mind had always been restless. Sketches of machines, notes on weights and balances and pressure, long quiet columns of figures that would have meant nothing at all to most people in this wide world. But they meant something to her, because he had taught her this language. On the floor of his study, year after patient year, he had pressed it into her like a second mother tongue. The numbers, the patterns, the deep, hidden order he swore ran beneath the whole wild chaos of the living world. And as she turned the pages now, she could almost hear his voice rising up out of the paper, the low rumble of it, the way he would catch himself mid-sentence, struck by some new idea, and go silent for a long moment, staring at nothing, while the whole machine of his mind turned over. She had loved those silences. As a child, she had learned to sit very still inside them, to wait, because what came out the other side was always something worth the waiting. And now, in a ruined cabin at the end of a broken road, with nothing left of him but ink upon a page, it was the last living piece of him that she had. So she read. She searched for anything, any small mention of the ridge, the cabin, that strange grand fireplace, built far too large and far too fine for the humble little house wrapped around it. The hours slipped past, unnoticed. The pale light shifted slowly across the floor. The oil in her lantern burned low, and then lower still. Twice she nearly gave up. Twice she set the notebooks down and pressed the heels of her hands against her aching eyes and told herself she was chasing a ghost. that there was nothing here, that grief was making her see patterns in the dark where no patterns lived. And twice. She picked the notebooks back up again, because that was the thing he had taught her, above all else. You do not stop just because it is hard. You stop when you have the answer, and not one moment before. And just as her eyes began to ache and blur, just as a small, bitter voice deep inside her began to whisper that the whole long, sleepless night had bought her nothing at all, a folded slip of paper slid loose from the back of one notebook. It fluttered down and came to rest against her knee. She picked it up. She unfolded it slowly, so carefully, the way a person unfolds a thing they already half suspect is precious beyond measure. And her breath caught hard in her throat. It was a drawing, not a sketch of one of his great machines, not a note about the company or the trucks or the work that had built his whole towering world from a single truck and a dream. It was a diagram of a mechanism, something hidden, something clever and quiet and infinitely patient, a careful arrangement of weights and counterweights, and a slow building pressure. And there, scrawled along the margin in his sharp, unmistakable hand, 3 small words that lifted the fine hairs along her arms. Heat opens it. Eleanor lowered the page, slowly, and she raised her eyes, from the drawing trembling in her hands to the great stone fireplace, standing cold and silent and waiting across the room. Heat opens it. She had been trying to build a fire on the floor of the hearth, where the kindling sat. But the diagram did not point to the floor. It pointed higher, to a single stone, set into the left side of the great fireplace, a pale, smooth stone, jutting out just a little, just slightly further than all the others crowded around it. She crossed the room, her heart beginning to pound against her ribs, and she found it, there, at about the height of her chest, a smooth pale stone, lighter in its color than the gray rough ones pressing in around it. She laid her open palm flat against its surface. It was cold, so very cold. According to the careful lines of her father's drawing, the thing she sought needed heat to wake it. Sudden heat, sharp and close and fierce. Heat aimed directly at that one cold sleeping stone. Her hands were shaking now. She reached for the small torch she had bought in town, the one she used for boiling water fast on the bitter frozen mornings. She turned the little valve, struck the spark, and the blue flame roared to life with a hiss. She lifted it, and she held it steady against the pale, cold stone. 1 minute passed. The cabin was dead silent, save for the low, steady roar of the flame. 2 minutes. Her arm began to ache, then to burn with the holding. The stone began to darken, to sizzle faintly, radiating a heat she could feel pressing back against her own face. She held it. She held it. And then, click. A deep, resonant, metallic sound. It came up through the old floorboards, up through the soles of her worn boots, up into the very center of her chest. The sound of something heavy, something ancient, something that had been locked and waiting in the dark and the silence for a very long time. Unlatching. Eleanor killed the flame and stepped back, her heart climbing into her throat. A low, slow hiss of air breathed out from somewhere deep inside the stone. A long exhale, as if the cabin itself had been holding its breath all these long, lonely years. and was only now, at last, letting it go. And then, with a deep grinding groan of stone dragging hard against stone, the back wall of the fireplace began to move. It swung inward, slow, ponderous, heavy beyond reckoning. Pale dust cascaded down from the seams in soft, ghostly sheets. That whole rectangular section she had found beneath her fingertips the night before, the smooth false mortar, the part that did not belong, swinging open on some great hidden hinge to reveal a void beyond, a pitch black emptiness, and out of it rushed the draft, the same steady, patient pull of air she had felt against her palm the night before. Only stronger now, colder, smelling of poured concrete and stale shut-away years, and old paper. Eleanor stood frozen before it. Her breath caught high and hard in her chest. She reached slowly for her flashlight, clicked it to its very brightest setting, and aimed the white beam straight into the dark. The light cut clean through the gloom and found stairs. A narrow flight of stairs, poured concrete, smooth and modern, and utterly, impossibly out of place beneath a rotting mountain cabin, descending down and down into the earth. This was no root cellar. This was no old forgotten storm shelter. This was something built, something planned, down to the very last careful inch. Something that had cost a great deal of money and a great deal of quiet, patient care. By a man who did not want one single living soul to ever know that it was there. Eleanor stood at the very top of those stairs, the cold breath of the dark rising up around her ankles, and for one long moment she was afraid. Not of what was down there, but of what it would mean. Because the moment she went down those stairs, she understood, somehow, that there would be no coming back to the person she had been. That whatever waited below would change everything, would close one door forever, and open another onto a road she could not yet see the end of. And then she thought of him, of the coins spinning on the study floor, of his voice. Most people see a wall and they think wall. And she gripped her flashlight tight, the way a person grips the one solid thing in a world that is falling apart around them. And she took one slow step down, then another. And then she descended into whatever it was that her father had hidden away. All these silent years beneath the floor of the world. The stairs went down far further than she had expected. The air grew cooler with every careful step she took, drier, losing the damp, green, earthy smell of the mountain woods high above, and taking on something else entirely, something cleaner, something sharper. The strange, still, sterile smell of a place sealed carefully away from the passing of all time. She counted the steps as she went down. It was a thing he had taught her to do. Count. Measure. Keep your wits about you, even when your heart is hammering. Especially then. 40 steps. 45. 50. And at the very bottom. The stairs ended at a door. And it was not a door of wood. It was a great slab of brushed steel, heavy beyond all reckoning. Massive. The kind of door a man builds to keep the whole wide world locked out, or to keep something terribly precious locked safely in. Beside it, set flush into the cold concrete wall, glowed a small panel of soft red light, a lock. Eleanor stared at it, and a great wave of grief and exhaustion rose up all at once, threatening to pull her under and drown her where she stood. Of course, there was a lock, Of course, there was one more wall, one more barrier, one more locked door standing patient between her and whatever truth waited in the dark on the other side. She would never guess the numbers, not in 100 lifetimes. She would stand here in the cold, so very close, and never once get through. But then she stopped, and she made herself breathe, and she thought about him. Her father had never trusted birthdays. He had thought them lazy, sentimental, easy to guess, and easier still to steal. He had told her so more than once, in that gruff, impatient way of his that she missed now with a sudden physical ache somewhere beneath her ribs. No, when her father wanted to lock something away, truly, deeply away. He spoke instead the language he loved best in all the world, the language of numbers, of patterns, of that deep and quiet order he swore ran underneath everything that lived and breathed and turned. She closed her eyes, and she let herself remember the long lamplit evenings in his study, the way he would sketch a certain spiral on the back of an old envelope over and over and over again, and call it the most beautiful thing in all of mathematics. A pattern that hid itself, he told her, inside the curl of seashells, and inside the unfolding of flower petals, and inside the great slow turning of distant galaxies, far out in the dark. A number he had loved his entire life. A number he had folded into his work again and again, like a quiet signature that only she would ever know to read. She could see his hands as he drew it, the ink stains on his fingers, the way he would tap the pencil twice against the paper when he was pleased with something. This one, he had told her once, holding the envelope up to the lamplight, is everywhere if you know how to look. The whole world is built on it. People walk past it every single day and never see it at all. He had smiled at her then, that rare, warm, private smile he saved only for her. But you see it, don't you, sweetheart? She opened her eyes. She brushed the fine dust from the keys with her fingertips, and slowly, one careful press at a time, she entered the numbers of that beautiful, patient pattern. The numbers he had carried in his heart all the days of his life. She finished, and she held her breath, and the soft red light turned green. A deep, heavy clunk echoed through the concrete, the quiet whir of some great mechanism releasing deep within the wall, and the massive steel door drifted slowly open, an inch, then two, letting out one long, low sigh of trapped and ancient air. It was as if, even now, even from beyond the grave, he had reached out and laid a hand against her cheek, as if he had whispered, "I knew you would remember. I always knew." Eleanor set both her hands flat against the cold steel, and she pushed. It swung wide, and the very moment that it did, light bloomed, bright, white, sudden. Lights flickering to life all around the room, woken by her movement, banishing the dark in a single held breath, and showing her, at last, what her father had built. It was a room that had no business existing beneath a ruin. Clean, smooth walls, a low, quiet hum threading through the still cold air. Banks of strange humming equipment lined along one wall, small green lights blinking in slow and patient rhythm, like the steady heartbeat of something that had been waiting, alone, in the dark and the silence, for a very, very long time. In the center of the room sat a simple desk, bare-brushed metal, and a single empty chair, and against the far wall stood a long row of heavy, fireproof cabinets. Eleanor walked forward, slowly, her legs trembling beneath her, her flashlight, useless now in all this brilliant light, hanging forgotten at her side. Because there, in the very center of that bare metal desk, sat an envelope, thick, sealed, waiting. And across the front of it, in handwriting she knew better than her very own. Handwriting she had been aching to see, just one more time, since the terrible gray morning they had told her that he was gone, were 3 small words. For Eleanor's eyes, her hand flew to her mouth. For a long moment she could not move, could not breathe, could only stand there, frozen, staring down at his handwriting, while the whole wide world narrowed itself down to those 3 quiet words on an envelope. He had known, somehow, some way. He had known that she would come here. He had known that she would stand exactly where she was standing now. He had reached forward through time itself, from somewhere far beyond the grave, just to leave her a single message, in a hidden room, beneath the floor of the world. Slowly, she reached out, and she opened it. Inside was a letter, folded thick, several pages of his sharp, slanting hand, and alongside it a few other things she did not yet understand. Small devices, a few keys, things that meant nothing to her yet. But it was the letter that she reached for first. She unfolded it with shaking fingers, and she began to read. And as she read, his voice rose up in her mind, so clear, so warm, so achingly real, that for one moment it was almost as though he were standing right there in the bright, quiet room beside her, speaking each word aloud, the way he used to read to her when she was very small. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then it means that I am gone. And it means that my very worst fears have come true, after all. And so the first thing, before anything else, is this. I am sorry, so very sorry, for the pain you have surely suffered by now, for the cruelty you have surely faced, for the home that has surely, by now, been taken away from you. Please understand this much. Leaving you that ruined old cabin was the only way in all the world that I could be certain you would find this place, without Diane or any of her circling lawyers ever once knowing that it was here." Eleanor's eyes filled, hot tears spilling over, falling, splashing dark spots across the page. She read on. "For a long time now, I have known that something was wrong. I have known, down in my very bones, that I was not simply growing old, that my body was not simply failing me on its own. I came, in time, to believe that Diane was the cause of it, that the medicine she so kindly, so tenderly insisted that I take every single day was not healing me at all, but doing the very opposite, slowly, quietly, a little at a time, so that no one in the world would ever once think to suspect a thing." Eleanor gasped. One hand flew to her mouth. The room seemed to tilt and sway around her. It was not only greed, it was not only a stolen will, and a stolen company, and a daughter cast out cold and alone into the dark. Diane had not simply manipulated him. She had. Eleanor could not even bring herself to finish the thought. By the time I understood it all, the letter continued, it was already far too late to fight her out in the open. Too late to win that kind of long, ugly war. She would have buried me in lawsuits. dragged everything I ever built through years upon years of slow ruin. And in the very end, she would have taken it all from you anyway. So I chose another path, a quieter one. She believes that the company is built on trucks, on warehouses, on contracts and steel, and all the heavy, solid things that a person can reach out a hand and touch. But you and I, Eleanor, you and I know the truth of it. She did. She had always known the true heart of the company, its real and only worth, is the thing that you and I built together, the two of us, those long, quiet nights when you were just a girl, working it all out on the floor of my study, with your tongue caught between your teeth the way it always was, the system that makes all the rest of it run. Without it, the trucks are blind, the warehouses stand empty, the whole great machine is nothing but expensive, useless metal rusting slowly in the rain. And that, my brilliant girl, that I have given to you. Eleanor's breath stopped in her chest. Some time ago, very quietly, before any of this ugliness ever began, I signed it all over to a small company, a company of which you and you alone are the sole owner. Every patent, every right, it belongs to you, and to no one else alive on this earth. Right now, the family business is only borrowing it, operating on a temporary agreement, a handshake put down on paper. But that agreement ends a short while after my death. It simply ends. And on the day that it does, everything that Diane believes she has stolen away will turn all at once to dust and ash in her grasping hands. Eleanor read those words, and then she read them again. And slowly, so slowly, she began to understand the true size and shape of the thing her father had done. He had not simply hidden away a treasure for her. He had hollowed out the entire empire, from the inside, quietly, patiently, while Diane was so busy counting up all the things that she could see and touch and put a price upon. He had quietly slipped out the one thing that truly mattered, the invisible, beating heart of all of it. And he had placed it gently into his daughter's two open hands. He had left Diane to inherit a beautiful, gleaming, hollow shell. And he had left Eleanor the key to the entire kingdom. The cabinets along the far wall hold the rest of it. The letter went on. Proof of what she has done. And not only of what she has done to me. She and Wesley have been taking from others, too. From the people who trusted us. From the good men and women who gave their whole working lives to this company. They have been quietly stealing away the savings of the very ones who could least afford to lose a single penny of it. Take it all, Eleanor, and do not mourn me any longer. Do not waste even one more precious tear on an old man who was already gone, and who would not trade a single day he had with you. Take what I have left for you, and set things right. I love you. I have always loved you, every single day of your life. And I am so very, very proud of the woman that you have become. Dad. Eleanor lowered the letter. For a long, long moment, she simply stood there, in that bright, humming, quiet room, deep beneath the cold, dark earth, the thin pages trembling between her fingers. And then she folded forward at the waist, and she wept, but not the way that she had wept in the car, on that long gray road all those nights ago. That had been the weeping of someone lost, someone broken, someone emptied out. Someone with nothing left in all the world. This was different. This was grief, yes, a great rolling wave of it. For the father who had suffered so quietly, who had carried this terrible knowledge entirely alone, all the way to the end, who had loved her so fiercely, so completely, that he had built a whole secret world out of stone and steel and patience, just to keep her safe after he himself was gone. She wept for all the things she had not known, for all the days near the end when she had sat beside him, holding his hand, and never once guessed at the war he was quietly fighting, the war he was losing, even then, with a smile on his face, so that she would not be afraid. He had protected her from the truth, even as it killed him. That was the kind of man he was. But beneath the grief, underneath it now, something else was beginning to rise. Something cold and clear and very, very steady. She wiped her eyes with the back of one trembling hand, and she turned, slowly, to face the long row of cabinets. She did not hear him come down the stairs. She was so deep in the papers by then, so lost in the truth unfolding before her, page by careful page, so far inside the maze of what her father had left her, that she never heard the soft footsteps on the concrete behind her, until a voice spoke quietly from the open doorway, low, worn smooth as a river stone. "So," it said, "you found it after all." Eleanor spun around, her heart leaping straight into her throat. It was the old man, Silas. He stood there in the doorway of that impossible room, his weathered hat held in his weathered hands, looking slowly around at all of it. And on his lined face was not surprise at all, but something gentler and sadder, something more like sorrow, and underneath the sorrow, something that looked almost like relief. "You knew," Eleanor breathed, "all this time. You knew this was down here." The old man nodded, slow and certain. "Your father asked me to watch over this place," he said. "A long while back now. To keep folks away from it. To make sure nobody came wandering up this ridge who had no business at all wandering up it." He turned the brim of his hat slowly in his rough hands, and to wait for the one who was meant to find it. He lifted his old eyes to her, and they were kind, so very kind. "He told me you'd know how," Silas said softly. "Told me that if his girl ever did come up this mountain, she'd puzzle out the rest of it on her own." A small, sad smile touched the corners of his weathered mouth. "Said you were the only one sharp enough in this whole wide world to manage it. The only soul he'd ever trust with the keeping of it." Eleanor's throat closed up tight. All this time, the firewood appearing on her porch in the gray of dawn, the quiet watching from the dark line of the trees, the old man at the edge of the clearing, lifting one slow and gentle hand in the morning cold. He had never been merely a stranger's kindness. He had been her father's last promise to her, standing patient guard over the dark, waiting all these long, lonely months for her at last to find her own way home. "How did you know him?" she asked. Her voice came out small. "My father. How did a man like that come to know a man like you?" Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked off, past her, at the humming green lights along the wall, as if he were looking at something a long way off, a long time ago. "He came up this ridge, years back," the old man said at last. "Looking for quiet," he said. A man with that much weight on his shoulders. He needed some place the world couldn't reach him. And I had the quiet to spare. A faint smile. We'd sit, some evenings. He'd talk, and I'd listen, mostly. He wasn't like the other men with money I'd known. The ones who come up here to shoot at things and leave their trash in the creek. He shook his head slowly. Your father, he'd sit on that porch and just look at the mountains, like they were telling him something, like he was trying to learn it by heart. Eleanor felt the tears rising again. A different kind now. He talked about you, Silas said gently. More than anything else, more than the company. More than any of it. The old man's eyes found hers. You were the thing he was proudest of in this whole world, child. You should know that. Whatever else happened, whatever they took from you, that part was always true. For a moment, Eleanor could not speak at all. She had come up this mountain believing she had lost the last piece of her father. And here, in the unlikeliest of places, was a man who had kept a piece of him safe, a piece she had never even known existed. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered at last. Any of it. Why didn't you just show me? Wasn't mine to tell? Silas shook his old head slowly. And some doors, a body's got to open up for their own self. Otherwise, well, they never quite come to believe in what's waiting on the other side of 'em. He stepped into the room then, just a little, and he looked, with quiet old eyes, at the open cabinets, the scattered papers, the whole terrible truth, spread out bare across that cold metal desk. I'm guessing you know now, he said gently, what it was they did to him. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Yes, she said, and this time her voice did not shake, not even a little. Silas studied her for a long, quiet moment, the way an old man studies the sky just before a hard season turns. Then he nodded, slow and sure, like someone who had finally glimpsed a thing he had been waiting a very long time to see. Then I expect, he said, you've got yourself some hard thinking ahead about what it is that comes next. He settled his old hat back down upon his head. Your father left you more than papers, you know, he said, pausing there in the doorway. More than this room of his. More than whatever's locked up tight in those cabinets there. He paused. He left you a reason to stand back up off the ground, child. And that, well, that right there is the true inheritance. All the rest of it, that's only paper. And with that, he turned, and he climbed slowly back up the stairs toward the light and the cold, clean mountain air above, leaving her alone once more with everything her father had hidden away for her. Eleanor turned back to the desk, to the letter, the proof, the whole quiet, devastating, world-changing truth of it. A clock was ticking now. She could feel it. Somewhere far away, in a world of glass towers and long polished tables and cold counting eyes, the days were already slipping away, one by one by one. But she was no longer the girl who had screamed alone into the dark on that first terrible night up here on the ridge. That girl had come up this mountain with nothing. This one was only just beginning. The work began the very next morning, and it was slow work, quiet work, the kind of work that no one ever sees and no one ever thanks you for. Eleanor sat at that bare metal desk, deep beneath the cold earth, and she opened the heavy cabinets one by one, and inside them, she found her father's patience, laid out like the rings inside an old tree. Years of it, folders, records, small quiet devices that held more than they had any right to hold. He had gathered it all, slowly, secretly, while his own body was failing him by the day, while the woman who shared his house was quietly taking his life from him, a little at a time, with a smile and a glass of water and a handful of pills. He had known, and he had spent his last good days building his daughter a way to fight back from beyond the grave. Eleanor read until her eyes burned and watered. She read until the green lights blinked their slow, patient rhythm, and the air grew thin, and the hours lost all their meaning down in that hidden room beneath the world. And what she found in all those careful pages was a story. A long, ugly story, told in numbers and dates, and quiet, undeniable proof. The money that had gone missing, the accounts that did not match, the savings of people who had given their whole working lives to her father's company, drained slowly away into places they were never meant to go. Diane and Wesley, their fingerprints were all over it, faint, careful, almost invisible. But there, her father had seen all of it. And with the last of his fading strength, he had written every piece of it down. But seeing a thing and proving a thing are two very different mountains to climb. Eleanor understood that much. She was no fool. She was an engineer, not a lawyer. She knew how to make a machine run. She did not know the first thing about how to make a courtroom move. So she did the only thing she could think to do. She went looking for someone who did. It took her the better part of a week to find him. A lawyer. A real one. Not the soft, tired old man who had read the will and could not meet her eyes. Someone sharp. Someone with hard, clear eyes who did not flinch easily. She drove the long, broken road down off the ridge. She sat across a wide desk from him. And she laid out what she had. Not all of it. Not the room beneath the floor. Not yet. But enough. Enough to make him sit up. He leaned back slowly in his chair. He looked at her, long and careful, the way a man looks at a hand of cards that has surprised him. And then he said the words that lit a small, warm flame of hope somewhere inside her chest. You may actually have something here. For the first time since that cold, gilded room with the long, polished table, Eleanor let herself believe. Believed that the scales might tip, that the truth might win after all, that her father's quiet, patient, impossible plan might actually, somehow, work. She drove back up the mountain that evening with something close to lightness in her chest, something she had not felt in a very long time. She should have known better, because the people who take from others do not give up so easily. And Diane had not built her cold little empire by being slow, or by being merciful. The first sign that something had gone wrong came just 3 days later. The lawyer stopped answering her calls. At first, Eleanor told herself it was nothing at all. He was a busy man. He was buried in other people's troubles. He would call her back when he had a moment. But the silence stretched on. 1 day, then 2, then 3, and then, at last, a letter came. Not from him, from his office. Just a few cold, polite lines on heavy, expensive paper, telling her that he would no longer be able to take her case, that a conflict had arisen, that he wished her, of course, the very best of luck. Eleanor read it twice, and then slowly she understood. He had not let go of her case because it was weak. He had let go of it because it was strong. Someone had gotten to him. Someone with deep pockets and a long reach and every reason in the world to make this small problem quietly, painlessly disappear. Diane. Of course it was Diane. Eleanor stood there in the cold clearing, the letter trembling in her hand, and she felt that small, warm flame of hope she had let herself feel. Gutter and dim, but it did not go out. Not yet. The next blow came harder, and this one, Diane did not bother to hide at all. It came on a gray afternoon, in the form of a thick envelope, hand-delivered to the cabin by a man in a dark suit who would not meet Eleanor's eyes. He simply pressed it into her hands, climbed back into his clean black car, and drove away down the broken road, his tires throwing up mud. Eleanor opened it standing right there in the clearing, and the cold that came over her had nothing to do with the mountain wind. It was a lawsuit, or the beginning of one. Page after page of dense, cold language, and buried inside all of it, like a knife wrapped in silk, was the thing Diane had decided to claim. That in his final months, the old man had not quite been himself. That his sharp mind had gone soft near the end. That he had grown confused, forgetful, easily led, not truly capable in those last quiet weeks of understanding the papers that were placed before him to sign. And if his mind had been failing him, then everything he had signed in those final months might mean nothing at all, including the one thing he had signed over to his daughter, the invisible beating heart of the whole company, the single weapon that Eleanor had. Diane was going to try to take it by telling the world that a dying man had not known what he was doing when he reached out with the very last of his strength to protect his only child. It was a lie. A vicious, calculated, bottomless lie. But it was the kind of lie that might actually work, because the one man who could have stood up and sworn otherwise was gone, forever, into the cold ground, and the clock was still ticking, quietly, steadily, counting down. But Diane was not finished. That was the thing Eleanor was only beginning to understand about her stepmother. The woman did not strike once and step back. She struck and struck and struck again until the thing in front of her stopped moving. The whispers began within the week. Eleanor felt them before she understood them. The way you feel a change in the weather, in your bones, before the first cloud ever shows. The next time she drove into town, the man at the gas station who had always given her a nod looked away. The woman at the little grocery who had once helped her find the cheapest flour was suddenly very busy with something behind the counter. It was small. It was quiet. But it was there. And then, at Margaret's diner, she found out why. "Somebody's been talking," Margaret said, low, sliding a cup of coffee across the counter and not quite meeting her eye. "About you, child." Eleanor went still. "Talking how?" Margaret hesitated. And then, because she was not the kind of woman who lied to spare a feeling, she told her straight. There was a story going around, that the young woman up on the ridge was not quite right, that she'd come unhinged with grief, that she was making wild, ugly accusations against a poor grieving widow, that she'd been cut out of her own father's will because even he, at the end, had seen something troubled in her, something unstable. "They're saying," Margaret said quietly, "that you're not to be trusted, that maybe a person ought to keep their distance." Eleanor's coffee cup trembled, just slightly, in her hand. She understood now exactly what Diane was doing. She was not only trying to win in some far-off courtroom, she was poisoning the ground beneath Eleanor's feet, turning the few people she had into strangers, making sure that when the time came, there would be no one left in all the world willing to stand up and say, "I know that girl, and she is telling the truth." It was clever, it was cruel, and it was working. Margaret reached across the counter then and laid her warm hand flat over Eleanor's cold one. "Now you listen," the old woman said fiercely. "I've known liars my whole life. I can smell one across a room. And whatever that woman is selling down in this town, I'm not buying a word of it. Not one word. You hear me?" Eleanor nodded, but the lump in her throat was too big to speak around, because for every Margaret, there were 10 others who had already turned away. That was the night Eleanor very nearly broke. It had been raining hard all evening, a cold, drumming mountain rain beating on the patched roof, finding the small crack she hadn't yet found, and sealed. She sat alone in the cabin, a single lantern burning low, and she stared at the dark wall, and she felt the whole thing slipping away from her like sand through her open fingers. Her father had built her a fortress, and now Diane was finding the door. No, it was worse than that. Diane was not only finding the door, she was burning the whole field around it. The lawyer, gone. The town, turning. The lie spreading, quiet and patient, like rot through the roots of a tree. Eleanor had no lawyer left, no money to hire another one, no time at all, with the clock running down toward zero, and a stepmother who had already proven, beyond any doubt, that she would stop at nothing, not at theft, not at lies, not at turning a whole town against a grieving girl, not even at murder. What chance did one young woman truly have, alone, against all of that? She felt 24 years old. She felt small and tired and so very alone. She felt exactly the way she had felt in that cold room at the very beginning when the lawyer had said the word cabin, and her whole future had collapsed in on itself like a house of ash. She put her face down into her blistered, work-roughened hands, and for the very first time since she had found the hidden room beneath the floor, she let herself wonder if she should simply stop, walk away, vanish into the woods. Let Diane keep her hollow shell, and her stolen money, and her terrible buried secrets. What did it matter? What did any of it matter now? Now that he was gone, and never coming back? Now that the whole world seemed determined to believe the worst of her? Now that even the small kindnesses of a small town were curdling, one by one, into suspicion? Maybe Diane was right. Maybe she was just a foolish dreamer in over her head. Maybe the smartest thing, the only thing, was to disappear. The rain came down harder, and in the dark of that cabin, Eleanor Brant came as close to giving up as she ever had in her life. There was a knock at the door, soft, patient, unhurried. Eleanor wiped her face hard with the back of her hand, and she rose, and she opened it. It was Margaret, the old woman from the little diner, standing there in the cold pouring rain, in a worn brown coat, holding a covered dish wrapped careful in a dish towel against her chest. "Saw your light from down the road," Margaret said simply. "Figured you likely hadn't eaten a thing." She had driven that long broken road, in the rain, in the dark, For a girl, she barely knew it all. For a girl, half the town was busy whispering about. Eleanor stepped back wordlessly and let her in. Margaret set the warm dish down on the table. Soup. The good smell of it rose up and filled the small cold room. And then the old woman turned, and she looked at Eleanor's face, truly looked at it, the way only an older woman who has known her own long share of grief knows how to look. And she saw all of it, every bit. "Sit down, child," she said gently, and Eleanor sat. And then, to her own great surprise, she began to talk. It came out of her in broken pieces at first, halting, then faster and faster still. The will, the cabin, the cold room with the long polished table, and then, slowly, the rest of it, too. The room beneath the floor, the letter in her father's hand, the terrible truth of what Diane had done to him. She had not meant to tell all of it, but it came pouring out of her, all at once, like dark water through a broken dam. And Margaret simply sat there across the table and listened, and did not look away, not once, not even at the worst of it. When at last Eleanor was finished, when the whole terrible weight of it lay there on the table between the two of them. Margaret was quiet for a long, long moment. Then she reached across the worn wood, and she took Eleanor's blistered hand into both of her own warm, steady ones. "Now you listen to me," she said, "and you listen close." "Your father didn't leave you a fortune," Margaret said. "Not really. Not the way you're thinking." Eleanor looked up at her, blinking. "Oh, he left you papers, sure enough. And he left you whatever it is hidden up here that's had you walking around looking like a ghost these past weeks." The old woman's eyes were steady and clear and kind. "But that's not the real thing he left you. Not the true thing." She squeezed Eleanor's hand. "He left you a reason to stand up. That right there. That's the inheritance, child. Not the money, not the company, the standing up." Eleanor's throat closed up tight. "But I don't know if I can," she whispered. "I don't know if I'm enough to fight her. She has everything. Everything. The money, the lawyers, the lies. She's turning the whole town against me, Margaret. She's making them all believe I'm crazy. And you have the truth," Margaret said firmly. "And you have a father who loved you enough to spend his last dying breath in this world trying to put it into your hands." The old woman leaned in close across the table. "Let me tell you something about women like that, Diane. I've met a few in my time. They are very, very strong, right up until the moment somebody stops being afraid of them. And then you find out it was all just smoke, all just fear. There was never anything solid underneath it at all." Her voice dropped, soft and fierce. "So now, here's the only question that matters tonight. Are you going to throw all that away? Are you going to let her win this thing and make a liar out of a good man lying in his grave?" A breath. "Or are you going to stand up and finish what he started?" The lantern flickered between them. The rain drummed on, steady, on the roof above, and something deep in Eleanor's chest, something that had been bent very nearly to the point of breaking, slowly began to straighten itself back up. "No," she said quietly. The word came out steady. "No, I'm not going to let her win." Margaret smiled, small, fierce, satisfied. "There she is," the old woman said softly. "There's your father's girl." Eleanor was not alone after that night. That was the thing she came, slowly, to understand. In the long, hard days that followed, she had believed, in her very darkest hour, that she was just one girl, standing alone against an empire. One small, frightened voice against all that cold money and all those careful lies. But she had been wrong about that. So very wrong. Margaret began coming up the ridge in the evenings, bringing food, bringing company, bringing that plain, stubborn, unbreakable kind of courage that older women so often carry quietly inside them. The kind forged long ago in their own private battles that no one ever thought to write down. And the whispers in town did not frighten Margaret. If anything, they seemed to make the old woman dig in harder. She had a way, Eleanor noticed, of mentioning Eleanor's name a little louder than necessary, right there at the diner counter. Of telling anyone who would listen exactly what kind of girl was up on that ridge. A hard worker, an honest one. The kind who counted out her last coins for a bowl of soup and said, "Thank you," like she meant it, slowly, quietly, one cup of coffee at a time. The old woman began to turn the tide back, and Silas came too. The old man sat with her at the cabin table in the lantern light, and he told her more stories about her father, this kind of man he had truly been, out in the world, the way he had treated the people who worked for him, the way he had remembered every one of their names, and their children's names, and the small, quiet troubles of their lives. "That right there," Silas told her one evening, his old eyes steady, "is the thing you're really fighting for. Not the money, child. Not the company. Those folks." And he was right. Because as Eleanor went back down into the room beneath the floor and read deeper and deeper into everything her father had so carefully gathered, she began to find the faces hidden behind the cold numbers, the people that Diane and Wesley had quietly stolen from. They were not just figures on a page, not just lines in a ledger. They were the men and women who had given her father their loyalty, year after year, decade after decade, and in return, in the dark, behind their backs, their savings had been quietly drained away. The small, careful nest eggs they had built up over a lifetime of honest work, set aside for the years when they could work no longer, gone, and one name, in particular, stopped Eleanor cold. An older woman, a widow, someone who had worked for the company nearly the whole of her long life, who had trusted them completely, who had set aside a little every single month, faithfully, for the quiet years at the end. And now she had nothing left at all. And the cruelest part, the part that made Eleanor's hands shake where they rested on the cold metal desk, was that the widow did not even know it yet. She was out there somewhere in the world right now, growing older, believing with her whole heart that her small, careful savings were safe and sound, and waiting patiently for her, when in truth they were already gone, spirited silently away into Diane's deep hidden accounts. Eleanor sat there in the cold, quiet room, staring at that one name on the page, and the very last of her fear burned clean away, because this was no longer only about her. It was no longer only about her own stolen inheritance, her own broken heart, her own ruined future on a mountain. It was about that widow and every other soul like her. It was about a whole room full of decent, trusting people who had handed the work of their entire lives to the wrong family. and who would grow old with nothing unless someone, somewhere, stood up. And Eleanor was the only one who knew. She was the only one in all the world who could give it back to them. Her father had not handed her a weapon for revenge. He had handed her a way to make things right. And she would. She swore it, there in the dark, with her open palm pressed flat against the cold steel of his desk. She would. She stopped trying to find another lawyer after that. There simply was not time. And besides, Diane could reach any of them, buy any of them. That much was clear now. So Eleanor did, instead, the one thing her father had spent her whole childhood teaching her to do. There on the floor of his study, all those years ago, she built her own machine. She organized every last thing, every record, every account, every careful trail her father had left behind for her, and every new one she dug up herself in the long nights. She laid it all out, clear and ordered and undeniable, the way a person lays out a proof, step by step by step, so that anyone who looked upon it could not, however hard they tried, look away again. She worked through the long nights, the lantern burning low and gold, Margaret's good soup slowly growing cold at her elbow, forgotten, and piece by patient piece, the whole picture came together. It was not enough simply to know the truth. She had understood that from the very beginning. She had to make the truth so plain, so clear, so utterly impossible to deny, that no whispered lie about a dying man's failing mind could ever hope to stand against it. She had to make it perfect, and slowly she did. But there was still a hole in it, one missing piece, one gap she could not seem to close, no matter how she tried, because all the careful records in the world could prove, beyond doubt, that the money had moved, that savings had quietly vanished, that the accounts did not add up the way they should, but they could not, on their own, prove who had given the order. And Diane was careful. Oh, she was so very careful. She had kept her own elegant hands perfectly clean through all of it. The orders had always come through others, through Wesley, and without a single clear voice somewhere saying plainly, she did this, she is the one. Diane could still slip the net, could still hold up those clean hands and swear she had known nothing at all, could still point to her dead husband's failing mind and turn and walk away from every bit of it. Eleanor needed someone from the inside, someone who had been there in the room, someone who knew, who had heard the orders given with their own 2 ears. And there was, in all the world, only one single person who fit. The one person she could never, ever in her life have imagined would help her. But before that person ever came, Diane made one last move, and it was the cruelest of them all. It came again on a gray afternoon, but this time it was not a man in a dark suit. This time it was Diane herself. Eleanor heard the car, looked up from her work, and saw through the grimy window the long pale shape of her stepmother's car easing to a stop in the muddy clearing. For a moment, she could not move. Then she rose, and she went out onto the porch, and she stood there, in the cold, and she waited. Diane stepped out, immaculate as ever, even here, even in the mud and the wet, in her pale, expensive coat. She looked up at the ruined cabin, at the mended roof, the cleared porch, the small, hard evidence of all Eleanor's labor, and something flickered across her face, something that might almost have been surprise. as if she had expected to find the girl already broken, already gone. "You've been busy," Diane said. Her voice carried up, smooth and cool, across the clearing. Eleanor said nothing. Diane took a step closer, and when she spoke again, the smoothness had a new edge underneath it. Something almost gentle, something almost kind, which was, Eleanor would later understand, the most dangerous thing about her. "I didn't come to fight," Diane said. "I came to offer you a way out, before this gets any worse, for both of us." She let that hang in the cold air. "Walk away," Diane said softly. "Sign the papers my lawyers send. Give up this fantasy, and I'll see that you're taken care of. A real sum of money, Eleanor. Enough to start over, anywhere you like, far away from this terrible little mountain." A pause. "You could have a life again, a comfortable one. All you have to do is stop." And for one long, terrible moment, Eleanor was tempted. She was so tired, so worn down. The money would be real. The escape would be real. She could lay this whole crushing weight down and walk away and never look back. Diane saw it. Of course she saw it. She had spent her whole life reading the weakness in people. "There it is," Diane murmured almost tenderly. "You're a sensible girl underneath it all. You know there's no winning this. Not against me." A small, cool smile. "Your father never could, you know, in the end." And that was the mistake, because at the sound of those words, "Your father never could," something hardened in Eleanor all the way down. Something turned, finally and completely, to stone. She thought of the widow, the savings gone, the quiet years stolen. She thought of her father, on the porch of this very cabin, looking at the mountains like he was trying to learn them by heart. She thought of the spinning coin. Most people see a wall, and they think, wall. And she looked at Diane, and she smiled, a small, calm, certain smile that she felt the woman did not like at all. "You should go now," Eleanor said quietly. Diane's face changed. The warmth drained out of it like water out of a cracked glass. "You're making a mistake," she said, flat, cold. "The mask gone now." "No," Eleanor said. "For the first time in a long while, I'm not." And she watched her stepmother climb back into her pale car. And she watched it crawl back down the broken road. And she understood, standing there in the cold, that she had just turned down the only easy doors out of this. And that she was glad of it. Wesley came to her in the dark 3 nights later. She did not expect it. She had not asked for it. She had, in truth, very nearly forgotten him in all of this. He had always been the smaller of the two, the follower, the shadow, the one who smiled only when his mother smiled and took only what his mother told him he should take. But fear, it turns out, can change a person right down to the bone. She heard the car first, coming slow up the broken road in the dark. She saw the twin headlights swing across the black trees, and for one cold, awful moment, she was certain it was Diane herself, come up the mountain at last to do something far worse than offer her money. But it was not Diane. It was Wesley. He climbed out of the car alone, and there, in the spill of lantern light from the open cabin door, Eleanor saw that he looked terrible, gray, pale, hollow about the eyes, like a man who had not slept a full night in a very long time, like a man being slowly, quietly eaten alive from somewhere deep inside. "I need to talk to you," he said. And his voice was not the smug, easy voice from that cold room with the long, polished table. It was the small, cracked voice of someone who was deeply, truly afraid. He sat down at her table, the very same table where, not long before, Margaret had pulled her back from the edge of giving up. And for a long while, he just sat there, staring down at his own folded hands, saying nothing at all. "She's going to let me take the fall for all of it," he finally said. His voice was very quiet. "When it comes apart, and it's coming apart now, I can feel it every day." He lifted his eyes to her face. It was her idea, all of it, from the very start. The money, the hidden accounts, the whole thing. She built it. She told me exactly what to do, every step. And like a fool, like the coward I've always been, I did it. A short, bitter, broken laugh. And now she's making good and sure that it's my name on everything, every paper, every order, so that if anyone ever does come looking, it's me they find, not her, never her. He swallowed hard. "She used me," he said, even quieter now. "My whole life, she used me up, and I let her do it, because I was afraid of her. The same way everyone's always been afraid of her." He was quiet for a moment, and then, in a voice so low she almost missed it, he said the thing that she understood had cost him the most. "I knew," he said, "about your father. The medicine, near the end. I knew what she was doing. And I said nothing. I told myself I wasn't sure. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself 1,000 things." His hands were shaking now. "But the truth is, I was just afraid. And a good man died. And I stood there. And I let it happen." The silence in the cabin was absolute. Eleanor sat very still. She did not trust herself to speak, because here was the man who had smiled at her across that cold table. Here was the man who had warned her, sharp and cruel, to be careful what she said about a grieving widow. Here was a man who had stood by, knowing, while her father was slowly killed. She had every right in the world to hate him. And yet, looking at him now, gray and hollow and shaking, and finally telling the truth, she found that what she felt was not hatred. It was something closer to pity. He reached into the inside of his coat, and he drew something out, and he set it down, gently, on the worn table between them. "This proves it was her," he said, "all of it. Her voice, her own words, her orders, plain as day. Everything you'd need." Eleanor stared down at it. The last missing piece. The one single thing she could never, ever have gotten on her own. No matter how long she searched, no matter how hard she worked. Handed to her now, in the dark, by the very last person in all the world she would ever have thought to ask. "Why?" she whispered. She could barely get the word out. "After everything, after all of it, why would you ever help me?" Wesley was quiet for a long, long moment, and when at last he answered, his voice was very small and very tired. "Because I am so tired of being afraid of her," he said. "I've been afraid my whole life, and I'm done." He paused, looked down at his hands again, and because, whatever else I am, whatever else I've done in this life that I can't ever take back, his jaw tightened. "I find that I don't want to be the kind of man who lets an old woman lose every cent of her life savings and just stands there and says nothing at all." He rose to his feet, and then, at the door, he paused. As if there were one more thing, one last weight he had carried up that mountain and meant to set down before he left. "She's selling," he said quietly. "The whole company. Soon. She wants it gone before any of this can catch up to her." He swallowed. "I'll get word to you. The day. The place. You should be there, Eleanor." A breath. Somebody ought to be. And then he turned back once more. "He was good to me, you know," Wesley said, very quietly. "Your father. Far better than he ever had to be. Far better than I ever once deserved." A long pause. "I'm sorry, Eleanor, for all of it. Every bit. I know that word doesn't mean much coming from me now, but I am. I truly am." And then he was gone, out into the dark, back down the long broken road, and Eleanor sat there, alone, in the lantern light, with the very last piece of the whole puzzle resting there in her two open hands. She turned it over slowly, again and again. The thing that Wesley had given her changed everything. She had spent these long weeks building a machine to prove that money had moved in the dark. And now she held the voice that proved exactly whose hand had moved it. She had been building a careful case about quiet theft. And now she could prove it ran all the way up, to the very top, to Diane. The empire was no longer a fortress at all. It had become a house of cards, trembling in a draft. And Eleanor was holding the one single card that would bring the whole towering thing crashing down. She gathered it all together then. Every record, every account, every careful proof her father had left behind for her. And now, at last, the final missing piece, brought to her in the dark of night by a frightened man trying, at the very end of everything, to do one single decent thing with his life. She laid it all out, one last time, in order, clean, complete. And then she sat back, in the low gold lantern light, and she looked quietly at the thing she had built with her own two hands, and it was finished. There was no hole left in it now. No gap for Diane to slip through. No whisper about a dying man's failing mind that could possibly stand against it. No clean, elegant hands she could hold up to the world and claim she'd known nothing. It was, Eleanor thought, exactly the kind of thing her father would have been proud of. A perfect machine, built with great care to do precisely one thing: to set the truth free. She rose then, and she walked out onto the porch she had rebuilt, board by board, with her own two blistered hands. The rain had stopped, the heavy clouds had broken apart and drifted off, and high above the dark sleeping ridge, the stars had all come out, scattered thick and bright and cold across the wide black mountain sky. Eleanor stood there, and she looked up at them, and she thought about the long, hard road that had brought her all the way to this quiet moment. The cold room with the long polished table. The drive south through the dark valley of her own despair. The ruin waiting for her at the end of the broken road. The night she had screamed alone into the dark with no one for miles to hear. And then the firewood appearing like magic on her porch. The bowl of soup that was always, somehow, too full. The old woman who drove through the rain in the dark for a girl she barely knew. The old man who watched over the lonely dark and asked for nothing. The truth, waiting patiently beneath the floor. The letter, in her father's own beloved hand. She had come up this mountain with nothing at all, cast out, thrown away like something broken, believing with her whole heart that she had lost everything that could ever matter, and somehow, in the wreckage of it all, she had found more than she had ever lost. She had found people who reached out a hand to her when they owed her nothing in the world. She had found a purpose worth standing up for, worth fighting for. She had found, in the ruins of her old stolen life, the quiet steel hidden deep in her own spine. The clock is still ticking. She knew that. Far away, in that cold world of glass towers and counting eyes, the last of the days were very nearly gone now. But Eleanor was no longer afraid. Not of Diane. Not of the lies. Not of any of it. She knew now exactly what she had to do. She knew exactly what was coming. And she was ready for it. She looked up at the stars one last time, and she let out a long, slow breath into the cold, clean mountain night. "All right, Dad," she said softly, her voice steady. "Sure. Let's go and finish it." Diane moved fast. She always had. And the word came, just as Wesley had promised it would. Quietly. In the dark. The day. The place. The hour the pens would come out. Selling. She was selling the whole company. The trucks, the warehouses, the contracts, the name. All of it. To some great faceless buyer from far away who wanted the empire whole and gleaming and ready to run. She wanted it gone. And she wanted the money in her hands. Before anyone thought to look too closely at the books, before any whisper of missing savings could rise up out of the dark, before her dead husband's quiet, patient checkmate could finish closing around her throat, she was going to take the money, and then she was going to vanish. And all that stood between Diane and her clean, cold escape was a single signature, a single stroke of an expensive pen, on a long polished table, in a room of glass, high above the world. Eleanor heard it all, and she understood, at once, exactly what it meant. The clock had very nearly run all the way out. The temporary agreement, the one her father had built so carefully, was about to expire. Days now. Perhaps even less than that. And on the day that it finally did, the invisible heart of the company would simply go dark. The thing that Diane was about to sell would, in a single instant, become worthless. An empty shell. A whole fleet of blind and useless metal, sitting still in the rain. Diane did not know that. She still believed, with all her grasping heart, that she was selling a living, breathing empire. She had no idea at all that she was about to sell a corpse. And Eleanor held the one single truth that could turn that grand gleaming room upside down. So she gathered everything, every record, every account, the proof her father had left waiting in the dark beneath the floor, and the voice Wesley had placed, trembling, into her hands. She packed it all, careful and complete, and in perfect order, the way her father had taught her, long ago, to pack a thing that truly mattered. And then she stood, one last time, in the cabin she had pulled back from the very edge of ruin with her own two hands. She looked slowly around it, the mended roof, the scrubbed and gleaming floors, the great stone fireplace, its secret door closed once more, holding its silence. This place had broken her on her first terrible night here. And then, somehow, it had built her right back up again, stronger than she had ever been before. "Wish me luck," she said softly into the empty room. But the truth was, she did not really need it. Not anymore. Margaret was waiting by the car, and so was Silas. Neither of them had asked to come along. They had simply appeared, the two of them, in the cold gray of the early morning, the way they always seemed to appear, exactly when she needed them most. "You're not going down that mountain alone," Margaret said, and there was no room for argument anywhere in her voice, only stone. "Not today. Not for this. Not after everything." Eleanor looked at the two of them, standing there in the cold. The old woman who had once driven all that broken road, through the rain and the dark, for a frightened girl she barely knew. The old man who had watched over her, quiet and faithful, through the longest nights of her life. Her family, not the one she had been born into, the one she had found when she had nothing left in all the world, and her throat went tight, so tight she could not get a single word out, so she simply nodded. And the three of them climbed into the car, and they drove down the long, broken road, off the ridge, and out of the quiet, sheltering woods, toward the cold, gleaming world that had once thrown her away like something worthless, to finish it, for good. The building rose up out of the city like a great blade of glass. Eleanor had walked into places like it before, in her old life, the life that had been stolen from her in less than an hour, at a long polished table not so very different from the one waiting upstairs. But she was not the same girl who had once crossed these cold marble floors. That girl had been soft, trusting, so sure down to her bones that the people who shared her blood would never in 1,000 years truly hurt her. This woman knew better now. She wore a plain dark suit, her hair pulled back, clean and severe, her face calm and still as the surface of deep water. She carried a single leather case in one steady hand, and inside that case, she carried the truth. Margaret reached out by the great glass doors and squeezed her arm once, hard. "Go on, child," the old woman said quietly. "Go on up there and set it right." Silas said nothing at all. He only nodded, but his old eyes, steady and certain, said everything that needed saying. And Eleanor walked in, alone. The room was high up, at the very top of the great blade of glass, a long table of dark gleaming wood, walls of glass on every side, the whole cold sprawling city laid out far, far below. And gathered around that table were the people who had come to carve up her father's life and sell off the pieces to the highest bidder. Diane sat at the head of it, dressed in pale, soft, expensive cloth, her face arranged once more into that same careful, practiced calm. Beside her sat the buyers, grave, important men in dark suits, their own fine pens already resting easy in their hands. And there, on the table, in the very center of it all, sat the papers, a thick stack of them, waiting only for a single signature to send a great fortune flying across the world and straight into Diane's waiting hands. Diane was smiling. She reached for her pen. A fine thing it was, gold and gleaming, catching the cold morning light. "I do believe," she said smoothly to the men across the table, "that everything is finally in order. Shall we put an end to all of this old business and begin something new?" The lead buyer nodded slowly. He reached for his own pen. "It has been a remarkably swift sale, Mrs. Brandt," he said. "We are eager to fold your fine company into our own." The pen lowered toward the waiting paper, and the great glass doors of the room swung open. Every head at that long table turned, and Eleanor Brandt walked in. She did not hurry. She did not flinch, or falter, or pause. She crossed that long, bright room with the calm, sure, unhurried stride of a woman who knew, deep down in her very bones, exactly why she was there. And Diane's careful mask cracked, just for a single instant, just enough. A flash of something cold and ugly and frightened passed behind her eyes, and then the smooth, practiced surface closed right back over it. And her voice came out, sweet and sharp as a blade drawn across silk. "What is the meaning of this?" Diane said. "This is a private matter. You have no business here, none at all. Someone, please, see this young woman out at once." "On the contrary, Diane," Eleanor's voice was quiet, but it carried, clear and cool, to every single corner of that silent glass room. "I'm the only person here who actually does have business at this table." She walked, unhurried, to the head of the room, and she set her leather case down upon the dark, gleaming wood, and she looked, one by one, slowly, at each of the grave, important men with the pens still in their hands. "Gentlemen," she said, "I would put those pens down, if I were you." A ripple of unease moved around the long table. The lead buyer frowned. He set his pen down, just a little. "And who, exactly," he said, "are you?" "I'm Robert Brandt's daughter," Eleanor said simply, "and I'm afraid the woman at the head of this table is about to sell you something that she doesn't actually own." Diane let out a thin, brittle little laugh. "Oh, she's confused, the poor thing. Grief does such terrible things to the young. My stepdaughter has had a difficult time of it lately. She inherited a little falling down cabin out in the woods, and I'm very much afraid it's quite gone to her head." A few of the men shifted in their seats, uncertain now, glancing between the two women. But Eleanor did not so much as turn her head to look at her. She simply opened the case, and she drew out the first stack of papers, and she laid them flat on the table, turned to face the buyers. "What you've all come here to buy," she said, "is a company built on trucks and warehouses and contracts, solid things, heavy things, things a man can reach out and put his hand on." She paused, let it settle. "But none of that, not one bit of it, is what makes this company worth the fortune you're about to pay for it." She slid the papers a few inches closer to them. "What makes it valuable," she went on, her voice steady and clear, "is a single piece of work. One thing. The thing that makes the whole great machine actually run. Without it, every truck out there on the road is blind. Every warehouse stands empty and useless. The whole gleaming empire is nothing but expensive metal, rusting slowly in the rain." The lead buyer's eyes had dropped to the papers now, and they were moving faster and faster down the page. "And that piece of work," Eleanor said quietly, "does not belong to this company. It does not belong to Diane. It was signed away, quietly and completely legally, long before my father ever died." She let the silence stretch out, taut as a wire. "It belongs to me." The room went very, very still. The lead buyer's face had gone pale. He looked up slowly from the papers. He looked across the table at Diane. "Is this true?" "Of course it isn't true," Diane snapped, and just like that, the sweetness was gone from her voice, entirely gone. What came out now was hard and flat and cold. "These are forgeries, lies, all of them, cooked up by a bitter, jealous girl who got nothing at all in the will and simply cannot bring herself to accept it. My husband left everything to me. Everything, as was his right. Your husband, Eleanor said evenly, was a great deal cleverer than you ever once gave him credit for. She reached into the case again. He saw exactly what you were, long, long before the end, and he made very certain that the one thing that truly mattered in all of this would never fall into your hands. She laid down a second set of papers. The agreement that let this company go on using his work, she said, was only ever a temporary one. A loan, nothing more. And that loan expires. Very soon now. She looked at the lead buyer. Perhaps you'd like to check the date for yourself. The lead buyer checked the date, and whatever color had still been left in his face drained right out of it. He sat back slowly in his chair. He looked down at the papers. He looked across at Diane, and then, at last, he looked up at Eleanor. "You're telling me," he said quietly, "that in a matter of days, this entire company becomes worthless." "I'm telling you," Eleanor said, "that you very nearly bought a corpse." Diane shot to her feet. The mask was gone now, completely gone. What stood there at the head of that long table was no longer a graceful, grieving widow in pale, expensive cloth. It was something cornered and cold and very, very afraid. "This is absurd," she hissed. "I will not stand here in front of these men and be slandered by some—" "Sit down, Diane." Eleanor did not raise her voice. She did not need to. There was something in it now, something steady and certain and entirely without fear. The quiet voice of a woman who had been all the way down to the very bottom of things and who had climbed slowly all the way back up. And Diane, to her own evident shock, sat back down. "You took everything from me," Eleanor said quietly. "My home, my future, the company my father promised me 100 times over, across all the years of my childhood. You stood in the doorway of my own family home, and you watched a hired man make certain I didn't carry off so much as a single photograph." She drew a slow, steady breath. "And do you know, I might have let you keep it all. The money, the hollow shell of it, your cold little victory. I might have just walked away, gone back up my mountain, and let you go on your way." Her eyes hardened then to something like flint. "But then I found out what else you'd taken." She reached into the case one final time, and this time what she drew out was different. These were not papers about her own stolen inheritance, not the will or the company or the hidden room beneath the floor. These were the faces hidden behind all those cold and careful numbers. "There's a woman," Eleanor said, and her voice changed as she said it, softened, deepened. "An older woman, a widow. She gave nearly the whole of her life to this company. She trusted it completely. Every single month, faithful as the sunrise, she set a little something aside for the years when she wouldn't be able to work anymore, for the quiet years at the very end." Her voice did not waver, not once, and you took it, all of it. You drained her savings away into your own hidden accounts, and then you let her go right on believing it was safe and sound. She doesn't even know it's gone yet. She's out there in the world right now, this very morning, growing older, trusting with her whole heart that the floor is still solid underneath her feet. She set the papers down, hard And she is not the only one. There are dozens of them, Diane. Dozens. People who gave you their loyalty and their trust and the honest work of their whole lives. And you robbed them quietly in the dark, and then you smiled at them in the daylight. She looked at Diane, and there was no longer any anger left in her face at all. Only something colder than anger, and cleaner. That, Eleanor said, is why I am truly here today. Not for the money, not even, in the end, for what you did to me. A pause. For them. The buyers were already gathering up their things. This sale is finished, the lead man said, and his voice was tight now, with a disgust he did not bother to hide. He rose to his feet, and the others rose along with him. Mrs. Brandt, you have attempted to sell us something you do not own. Our people will be in contact with yours, and I assure you, it will not be the kind of contact you are going to enjoy. And they left, without one more word, the great glass doors swinging slowly shut behind them. And then it was only the two of them, Diane and Eleanor, and the last terrible card, still waiting quietly in the leather case. Diane sat alone now, at the head of the long, empty table. The fortune she had murdered for had just evaporated into thin air, right in front of her eyes, in less time than it takes to tell. Her face had gone white as paper. Her hands, resting on the dark wood, had begun, very slightly, to shake. "You insolent little girl," she whispered, and her voice trembled with fury and with the first cold edge of real fear. "You think this is over? I am still the owner. I will bury you in lawsuits. I will drag this out for years. Do you hear me? I will drain every last cent that worthless cabin of yours is worth, and I will leave you with—" "You won't be doing anything," Eleanor said. "Not from where you're going." And she laid down the final piece, the thing Wesley had given her, in the dark, in the cold, quiet cabin, up on the ridge, the voice, Diane's own voice, her own words, her own cold, clear orders, plain and undeniable and impossible to explain away, the order to take from the widow, the order to drain the savings into the dark, the whole ugly thing laid bare at last upon the table, and alongside it, the rest, the proof that her father had not simply grown old and sick and tired, the careful records he had gathered in secret with the very last of his fading strength, the truth of what had really been slipped quietly into his medicine, day after day, by a tender, smiling, murderous hand. Eleanor set it all down on the table, and she watched the very last of the color drain out of Diane's face. "You didn't just steal his company," Eleanor said, very quietly now. "You didn't just throw me out into the cold without a backward glance. You didn't just rob a whole roomful of trusting people of everything they'd ever set aside." Her voice dropped until it was almost nothing at all. "You killed him, Diane. You killed my father. Slowly, quietly, with your own 2 hands. And he knew. He knew the whole time it was happening. And even then, even knowing, he still loved me enough to spend the last days of his life making certain that one morning, somewhere down the line, I would be standing right here, in this room, holding this." The silence in the glass room was absolute. Diane opened her mouth, and then she closed it again. There were no words left for her now. No lie clever enough. No smile sweet enough. No door left anywhere to slip through. The truth was on the table. and it could never, now, be unseen. There were others stepping quietly into the room now. People who had come to see that justice, at long last, was done. Eleanor did not need to say very much to them at all. The papers said all of it. The voice said all of it. Her father, reaching forward through time from somewhere far beyond the cold ground, said all of it. Diane rose slowly, on legs that no longer seemed quite steady beneath her. The grand, cold woman who had ruled by fear all her life, who had taken whatever she pleased and crushed whoever happened to stand in her way, was nothing now but a frightened figure in an expensive suit, in a room full of glass, with nowhere left in all the world to run. She looked at Eleanor as they led her toward the doors, and for the very first time, there was no venom left in it, no scorn, no cruelty, only a kind of stunned, hollow, bottomless disbelief that it had all come apart so completely, so fast, that the soft, trusting girl she had thrown away like so much garbage had been the very one to bring the whole towering thing crashing down. "How?" Diane breathed. "How did you ever—" "You looked at me once," Eleanor said simply, "and you saw a dreamer, someone soft, someone you could throw out into the woods and forget all about." A small, sad, knowing smile touched the corners of her lips. "You should have looked a great deal harder, Diane. A beat. I'm my father's daughter." And then they took her away, and Eleanor stood alone in the high, quiet glass room with the whole cold city spread out far below her feet. And she let out a long, long breath, one she felt as though she had been holding inside her chest for months. It was done. At last, it was done. Wesley faced what was coming too, and he did not run from it. That was the strange and unexpected thing about it, in the end. The frightened follower, the pale shadow who had spent his whole life simply doing whatever his mother told him to do. He stood up at the very last, and he answered for the things that he had done. Eleanor never once forgot that he had been the one to hand her the final piece, the one who, at the very end of everything, had finally chosen to do one single decent thing with his life. It did not undo the rest of it. It couldn't. Nothing could. But it was something. It mattered. And much later, when he sent word to her, asking only for her forgiveness, and nothing else in the world besides, she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was able to give it, not for his sake, for her own, because she had learned, up there on that mountain, in the long, cold, lonely nights, that carrying hatred is only its own slow kind of poison. And she had seen, up close, exactly what poison does to a person, what it had done to her father. She would not let it have her too. But the empire— that was the one great question that still remained, because the company was hers now. Truly, completely hers. The invisible heart of it. And with that heart, everything else as well. The trucks, the warehouses, the whole great gleaming machine her father had built, with his own 2 hands, from a single truck and a stubborn dream. She could sell it for a fortune almost beyond imagining. More money than she could ever hope to spend in 3 long lifetimes. She could walk away rich beyond all reckoning and never want for a single thing again for all the rest of her days. It was, after all, exactly what Diane had tried so hard to do, and for one moment, standing there in that high, cold glass room, Eleanor felt the quiet pull of it, the simple ease of it, the cold temptation just to take the money and go. But then she thought of the widow, the older woman out there somewhere this very morning, growing old, believing the floor was still solid beneath her feet. And she thought of all the others, the dozens of faces hidden behind the cold numbers, the men and women who had given her father the whole of their working lives, and who had so very nearly lost everything in the dark and never even known. And she knew then exactly what her father would have done, and exactly therefore what she would do. She did not sell it. She gave it back. Every cent that had been stolen, every dollar drained out of those trusting hands in the dark, Eleanor returned all of it. The widow's whole life savings, the careful nest eggs of every one of the others, restored. Every last penny accounted for. She made certain the people who had given their lives to that company kept their jobs and their dignity and the quiet security they had worked so very long and so very hard to build. She did not keep the empire for herself, to make herself rich and comfortable. She kept it to make it right, because she had finally understood the thing her father had been trying to teach her all along. The lesson hidden underneath the hidden room, underneath the proof and the patents, and the cold, clever checkmate he'd spent his dying days arranging. His real treasure had never once been the money. It had never been the trucks, or the warehouses, or the gleaming name on the side of a building. It had been the people, the ones he had trusted, the ones he had remembered, everyone by name, the ones whose children's names he had carried in his heart. That was the true inheritance, and Eleanor honored it with everything she had. The widow learned in time that her savings had somehow been returned to her. She never quite understood how it had happened. A quiet letter arriving one day, a balance restored, a small impossible grace appearing out of nowhere at all. In the very years when she had come to believe there were simply no more graces left in the world for her, she wept when at last she understood it. And somewhere far away, high up on a quiet green mountain, the young woman who had made it all happen never told a single living soul. She did not need to. And that, in the end, was the whole difference between Eleanor and the woman who had thrown her away. One had taken always in the dark and smiled in the daylight. The other gave quietly in the dark and asked for nothing at all in return. Eleanor went back up the mountain. She could have lived anywhere in the world now, any grand house in any gleaming city that she might care to name. She had the means for it now, and more. But she chose the cabin, the ruin she had pulled back from the very brink, board by board, with her own two blistered and bleeding hands, the place that had broken her on her first night, and then, slowly, patiently, had made her whole again. The place where she had screamed alone into the dark, and where, little by little, she had found her own long way back to the light. It was hers, truly hers. And not because anyone had handed it to her in a cold room, as a cruel and bitter joke, but because she had chosen it, freely, with her whole heart. And there is all the difference in the world, she had learned, between the place you are cast out to in shame and the place you choose, at last, to call your home. The seasons turned, slow and gentle, on the ridge. Margaret still ran her little diner down in the small, forgotten town below, and Eleanor sat at its worn counter most mornings now, and the soup was still, always, a little too full, and neither one of them ever once mentioned it. Silas still appeared at the edge of the trees from time to time, still lifted one slow, weathered hand in greeting, and still left, every so often, a neat, clean stack of split firewood beside the porch in the gray light of dawn, as if some promises do not end, even when the one who first asked for them is long gone. They were her family, the strange, unlikely, found family she had stumbled into on the worst day of her life when she had nothing left in all the world to give them. The ones who had shared her blood had thrown her away without a second thought, and the ones who had owed her nothing at all had quietly given her everything. On a clear, cold, bright morning, near the very end of this whole long story, Eleanor stood out on the porch she had built back from nothing. She held a warm cup of coffee in both her hands, warm against the chill of the mountain air, and she looked out at the mountains, rolling away soft and blue and endless into the gold of the morning light. And she thought about her father, about the long, quiet evenings in his study, about the spiral he used to draw over and over and call the most beautiful thing in all the world, about the coin he had set spinning on the floor all those years ago, and the lesson hidden inside it. Most people see a wall and they think, wall, about the secret he had built with such love beneath the floor of a ruin to keep her safe after he was gone. She thought about that cold room with the long polished table where the whole thing had first begun, and how very far away it all seemed now, how small, how powerless in the end. They had taken from her everything she had, the home, the money, the future, the name. But there was one thing, in the very end, that they had never once managed to lay a hand upon. One thing that had never, ever been theirs to take. Eleanor lifted her face to the rising sun, and she said it softly to the mountains, and to the morning, and to the memory of the man who had loved her enough to set her free. They took everything I had, she said, but they never could take what I am. And the great blue mountains held their ancient silence, and the light came up, slow and gold, over the sleeping ridge. And the young woman who had once lost everything in the world stood at last in the place that she herself had chosen, in the life that she herself had built, among the people that she herself had found. Home. Truly, finally, home.